On March 26, 922 in Baghdad, a strange mystic was brutally executed. After being beheaded, his body was burned and the ashes were thrown in the Tigris River. According to legends, the many onlookers were shocked as they could still hear chanting coming from the ashes, repeating the words, "Ana al-Haqq," I am the truth. The man who was executed on that day was Husayn Ibn Mansur al-Hallaj, who would go on to become one of the most famous, controversial, and legendary mystics in the history of the Islamic world, and probably of the world more generally. To many, his execution marks a major turning point in history, which would have a lasting impact on religion, philosophy, and literature. Al-Hallaj was a famous figure already during his own lifetime, and his death came after many years of controversy. But why did this untimely end happen? Was it, as many will assume, because he said controversial and blasphemous things and he was executed due to being seen as a heretic, or was it more due to the very chaotic political circumstances of that environment and at that time? Well, today we are finally going to explore this topic as well as the general life, teachings, poetry, and indeed death of one of the most enigmatic mystics in all of history, al-Hallaj. The life of Hallaj is shrouded in legend, but there are several accounts from later Sufi writers that retell it, a lot of which is probably hagiographical. But there is, for example, a relatively early account, supposedly from Hallaj's own son, Hamd, which gives us a basic outline that most scholars will at least agree upon. Hallaj was born around the year 857 in what is today Iran, in a town called Tur in the province of al-Bayda. He seems to have come from a Persian family lineage, at least on one side of his family, as it is reported that his grandfather had been a Zoroastrian that converted to Islam. But at the same time, the places where he was born and grew up, both in Tur and later also in Wasit, the city that he moved to when he was very young, they were both deeply Arabized in terms of culture and language. Indeed, most scholars agree that Hallaj probably never even spoke any Persian at all, but only learned Arabic as his main language. Once settled in Wasit, a relatively important city for Islamic learning, he received a good education in the sciences, including Islamic law and the Quran, the latter of which he seems to have become a kind of expert on. Some accounts also state that he seems to have been especially interested in the inner aspects of the Quran, rather than just outward practice. And this inclination really came to fruition when he was around 18 years old and travels to the city of Basra, where he became a disciple of the great mystic and maybe early Sufi, Sahel al-Tustari. Now, in many ways, the life of Hallaj is a story about Sufism, the movement that is often referred to as Islamic mysticism. But in fact, this is very early on in the development of that tradition, and the categories can be a little murkier. Sahel al-Tustari is often seen as one of the early Sufis who, among other things, wrote a very influential mystical commentary on the Quran. But at the same time, he was in some ways independent of the contemporary mystics in Baghdad, who are the first ones to actually call themselves Sufis and to develop some of the core vocabulary and ideas of Sufism more generally. This Baghdad school of Sufism was headed by Junayd, but also very significant figures like al-Muhasibi, Sari al-Saqati, and Abu al-Hussein al-Nuri. And after studying with Sahel al-Tustari for 2 years in Basra, Hallaj seems to have run into one of the more prominent Sufis from the Baghdad school, Amr al-Makki. In fact, it is from Amr that Hallaj becomes officially initiated into the Sufi path and receives the symbolic khirqa, or cloak of initiation. He studies with Amr and lives an ascetic life in Basra, performing the spiritual practices and techniques of Sufism. He also at this time gets married and has children with a woman called al-Husayn, daughter of another famous Sufi master, and whose brother was associated with the Shi'i-inspired Zanj rebellion. This is a detail that's going to come back and haunt him later in his life. But Hallaj is dedicated to his path and eventually also travels to Baghdad, where he becomes friends with and seems to study under the Sufi masters there, including Junayd and al-Nuri. Hallaj is thus connected with several different Sufi or mystical lineages at the same time. He studied with Sahl al-Tustari and his group in Basra, but he also was a disciple of the Baghdad school of Sufis, in the city of Baghdad. But at the same time, he eventually also kind of struck out on his own completely, became very independent of both of these groups. So he sort of straddles different worlds in this early environment of Sufism and Islamic mysticism. And that path to a kind of independence seems to have really started when he, in 883, decided to travel by himself on a pilgrimage to Mecca. There, he stayed for a full year in the courtyard of the Kaaba, constantly performing spiritual practices, fasting intensely, and meditating. And it was through these meditations at the Kaaba that Hallaj claims to have reached the highest mystical station and to have united with God. He says in a poem, "He chose me, drew me near, and honored me. The All advised me and taught me by the All. No part remains between my heart and guts without me knowing him by it, and him knowing me." It is from this time forward that Hallaj as we know him, the intoxicated mystic who shares his internal experiences loudly through shocking exclamations, is really born. He returns to Basra and then Baghdad, where he eventually actually moves with his family and starts preaching publicly about the moral downfall of his fellow Muslims, as well as the realities of mystical union. These activities garnered him a lot of followers and admirers, but also quite a lot of detractors and critics, including many of his old friends and teachers in the Sufi community. You see, the things that Hallaj were expressing about becoming annihilated and united with God weren't necessarily seen as wrong by his fellow Sufis. These were quite common teachings within the Sufi community. However, you weren't supposed to proclaim them publicly, right? These were supposed to be esoteric secrets kept within the community because they are such lofty realities and experiences that the common people who are not initiated into Sufism will very easily misunderstand what is said and interpret it in heretical and wrong ways, right? So the Sufis were generally very careful about revealing these secrets publicly, whereas Hallaj at this time seems to have completely just walked around preaching publicly to everyone, including about his mystical experiences about union with God, right? So he became very harshly criticized even by his own friends and masters, by Amr al-Makki, by Junayd it seems, for breaking this sort of unspoken rule, or perhaps spoken rule, about not revealing these secrets publicly. So it's not about him saying something that they saw as wrong, but rather about revealing that which was supposed to be kept secret. In this sense, most of the Sufis at that time, including Junayd, represent what is often termed a sober Sufism, whereas Hallaj and an earlier mystic from Iran, Abu Yazid al-Bistami, represents an intoxicated form of Sufism. And these two tendencies have often been in conversation and sometimes maybe even conflict with each other throughout the history of Sufism, although the distinction has, in my opinion, often been a little overemphasized by many scholars. But due to his very daring poems and preaching, Amr al-Makki, Junayd, and others directly condemned Hallaj. And he himself seems to have also distanced himself from the Sufis, at some point taking off the woolen garments associated with the movement as a form of asceticism. Now, some of his fellow Sufis stuck with him though, particularly a guy called Ibn Atta and the famous Abu Bakr al-Shibli, who would remain his friends and supporters all the way up until his death. He had basically struck out on his own, a kind of renegade mystic who was gaining an increasing amount of followers. Indeed, when he went for his second pilgrimage to Mecca in 894, it is said that he was accompanied by 400 disciples. In other words, Hallaj was becoming a very significant religious and mystical figure at that time. But again, he also had many enemies who consistently tried to defame him and ruin his reputation. During his pilgrimage, he was accused of being a sorcerer who was working with the jinn and was continuously harassed, including by his old master Amr al-Makki. But he continued to travel around the Islamic world and even outside it. After his second pilgrimage, he went on a long journey to Central Asia and even all the way to India. He wouldn't return until the year 902, when he once again goes to Mecca before returning home to Baghdad for the last time. Once back in Baghdad, he started acting strange, or should I say, more strange than usual. He could be found in the mosques and marketplaces, saying peculiar things, ecstatically exclaiming his mystical experiences and ideas. And even, it seems, in some cases, he seems to kind of express a wish for people to have him killed. He seems to say in many of his poems and in many stories that he wants to die. Many of the stories in the so-called Akhbar al-Hallaj, the news of Hallaj, tell of these kinds of exclamations and sayings. And it can be hard to know when he's talking about a kind of spiritual death. Again, this was common in Sufism to talk about being annihilated in God and using death as a kind of metaphor in that sense. It's hard to know if he means this kind of death, metaphorically, spiritually, or if he's, in some profound way, kind of predicting his own untimely end. In one famous poem, he says, "Kill me, friends, for in killing is my life. My death is in my life is in my death. Annihilation of my essence is the noblest of my glories, and my attributes remaining is the foulest of my crimes. My spirit tires of my life amid its lingering traces, so kill me, burn me in these fading bones, and later pass my dust in ruined tombs. You will find my lover's secret folded into my remains." It's even said that Hallaj built a kind of makeshift version of the Kaaba in his backyard and would circumambulate it instead of going to Mecca for the Hajj. In fact, it was this that was to perhaps prove the most controversial of all, and a key justification for his later execution, but we'll get there in time. Hallaj remained very popular as a preacher and spiritual master among the general population, having many followers and admirers, which would later come to be referred to as the Hallajiyya. There were even significant people in the aristocracy that became his supporters, including two Abbasid viziers, Ibn Hamdan and Ibn Isa. Hallaj's constant preaching and condemnation of the moral state and inequity in society had a very powerful effect. He said, "How long do you contest the one who sees you in a sea of errors, though you don't see him? Your way should be piety and religion, but your deed is the deed of the voluptuous. You think that you are free from any sin, but God's eye is the witness that observes you. Do you desire forgiveness for your sins? Yet you don't even seek his satisfaction. Can you be happy with your sins and errors, forgetting him when there is no other? Repent before you die, before the day when slaves encounter what their hands have done." These kinds of sermons and preachings that he would give in Baghdad were so popular and powerful that they seem to have kind of started a movement in the city that sought a kind of moral reform of society. And it seems that in some ways Hallaj may have been seen as a kind of figurehead for this movement, a movement that definitely in some ways threatened the power of the Abbasid regime. And this, I think, is very important for what happens at the end of this story. These poems and sermons also clearly point to an important fact, that al-Hallaj was undoubtedly a Muslim. Just like with many other Sufis in history, including perhaps most famously Rumi, it is sometimes claimed that Hallaj somehow stands outside of Islam, or that he was only Muslim in name while holding some other actual affiliation or philosophy. And just like with Rumi, this kind of position can only be upheld if one hasn't really read or engaged with his actual works to any significant depth. Regardless of any normative statements about heresy or what any sort of true Islam is supposed to be, there is no doubt that Hallaj saw himself as a Muslim and that his works are deeply dependent on the Islamic framework. The foremost European scholar of Hallaj in modern times is without doubt Louis Massignon. His life work was basically dedicated to Hallaj, and his massive 4-volume study called The Passion of Hallaj is a key source for anyone getting into the topic. Massignon is basically responsible for Hallaj being as famous as he is today. Now, for sure, he was a known name in Sufi circles in history, but nowhere near as central of a symbol and figure as he has become today. And much of this is owed to the work of Louis Massignon. Being a Catholic himself, he still saw in Hallaj a great inspiration, kind of comfort. A spiritual master who in more ways than one reminds us of Jesus and his life. But with that said, even he wouldn't go as far as denying the Muslim character of Hallaj. He says, "The question of how far this spiritual position is accepted in Islam can be debated. But what matters to us from the very outset is the fact that Hallaj was specifically a Muslim. Not just the original terms of his lexicon and the framework of his system, but the whole thrust of his thought derives from a solitary, exclusive, slow, profound, fervent, and practical meditation on the Quran." Now, of course, he was criticized by many contemporary Muslims, including his fellow Sufis, as we saw, as well as, for example, the significant scholar Dawood al-Zahiri, the founder of the Zahiri school of law. But many others, and from different schools, also defended and supported him. Indeed, when Hallaj was later imprisoned, his close friend and fellow Sufi, Ibn Attah, who also belonged to the Hanbali school of law, he actually organized a kind of demonstration along with a whole host of other Hanbali scholars, hoping to have him released. And it is interesting to consider where Hallaj himself lay on the madhab or school spectrum. As we mentioned, he grew up and studied primarily in Wasit, which at this time was a center for Hanbali learning in particular. And Massignon points out that there are references in his works to characteristically Hanbali teachings and Quranic interpretations. This suggests that Hallaj, if he adhered to any specific school at all, might himself have been a Hanbali. This is the school of law that was founded by Ahmed ibn Hanbal and is often seen as the most strict and puritanical of the 4 major schools of Islamic law. This might come off as surprising to many who associate Sufis, and especially mystics like Hallaj, with a kind of liberal attitude. We should remember, though, that at this time these schools were in their infancy and weren't fully formed in the way that we would recognize them today. But I think this is important to show that often the ways that we like to categorize these kinds of figures don't really sync up with actual history. Many of the mystics, and people today think mystics are these antinomian, sort of free, liberal thinkers. Often the mystics are the people that are most strictly adherent to the sort of religious law, whether it be Christian or Islamic or whatever. And Hallaj, in some sense, might be one such example. He might have been a Hanbali, which is obviously the most strict, most conservative of the law schools in Islam. Even though, again, this is early on, the schools aren't fully formed, they haven't taken on many of their characteristics yet. And certainly Hallaj is very unique, and he certainly goes against a lot of what we associate with a more non-Sufi sort of orthodox Islam. But we should also be careful to group things like that, because the Sufis were the orthodox Muslims for most of history, right? So it's a lot more complicated than we often like to believe. And Hallaj is a good, it's a good sort of jumping off point to getting into some of those discussions and realizing that history is complicated. But regardless of his affiliations in fiqh or law, his self-understanding as a Muslim is without question, which becomes very clear when we read his actual writings. Hallaj was, maybe surprisingly, a pretty prolific writer. He wasn't just some strange guy who walked around being provocative, but composed many different works, both poetry and prose. In Ibn al-Nadim's Fihrist, or Catalogue of Literature, he lists 46 books by Hallaj, and they vary greatly in topic, from commentaries on the Quran, strange mystical texts, and even treatises on politics. The problem with this is that almost none of this output survives today, giving us very little by Hallaj to actually study. He remained a controversial figure after his death, which might have contributed to why most of his works sort of disappeared. Now, we do have a bunch of poetry, which was collected into a diwan by Massignon in the 20th century. Many of these poems are uncertain in their legitimacy, some probably being apocryphal and written by other mystics, but still, this is a significant collection. Another surviving work, and perhaps his most famous, is a book called the Kitab al-Tawasin. This is an incredibly difficult and dense mystical treatise divided into 11 short chapters, or individual treatises perhaps, dealing with epistemology, the character and ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, and even the status of Satan, accompanied by diagrams and symbols that aim to portray some of the lofty mystical teachings. There's also a work called Akhbar al-Hallaj, or News of Hallaj. This isn't a work by the man himself, but a collection of stories, sayings, and poems from Hallaj compiled by his students, and serves as an important source not only for these direct quotations, but also for some details on his life. So what was it that Hallaj taught? What was his Sufism, so to say? What were those ideas that made him so controversial, but also that helped him survive for millennia up until today? While his status as a Sufi can be contested, there is no doubt that he studied under some of the major Sufi personalities and mystics of that time, including, as we saw, Sahl al-Tustari, Junayd, and Ahmed al-Makki. And a lot of his ideas and emphases thus fit rather well into a Sufi framework. In particular, Hallaj was very focused on the idea and experience of union with God. Through ascetic and spiritual practices, which the Sufis taught, on top of the prescribed prayers and rituals of the Islamic religion, the worshipper can strip himself of all worldly aspects, all personal traits and identifications, and ultimately to become annihilated. This state of annihilation is central to Sufism and is referred to as fana. And Hallaj expresses this union in many of his poems and writings. In one of his most famous and striking poems, he expresses these precise ideas about annihilation, union, and the collapsing of distinction between the knower and the known. رأيت ربي بعين قلبي فقلت من أنت قال أنت فليس للعين منك عين وليس عين بحيث أنت وليس للوحم منك وحم فيعلم الوحم أين أنت أنت الذي حست كل عين بنحو لا عين فأين أنت وفي فنائي فنا فنائي وفي فنائي وجدت أنت. I saw my Lord with the eye of my heart. I said, "Who are you?" He said, "You." But for you, where cannot have a place, and there is no where when it concerns you. The mind has no image of your existence in time, which would permit the mind to know where you are. You are the one who encompasses everywhere, up to the point of nowhere, so where are you? And in my annihilation was annihilated, and in my annihilation I found you. And this is also related to what is probably the most famous saying and story about Hallaj's life, when he, in a bout of ecstatic trance, exclaimed, "Ana al-Haqq," meaning, "I am the truth," or "I am the real." There are many different versions of when or how he is supposed to have exclaimed this, many claiming that it was after an intense session of Sufi dhikr or meditation practice. But regardless, it did become something strongly associated with Hallaj. Now, al-Haqq is one of the names of God in the Quran, which, as we said, can mean things like the truth or the real, sometimes even the right. What's important is that by saying "Ana al-Haqq," I am al-Haqq, Hallaj was seemingly identifying himself with God. This is an example of what is known as a shat, an ecstatic utterance that was common among certain Sufis and mystics. Another famous example of this is Hallaj's near contemporary, Abu Yazid al-Bistami, who is thought to have exclaimed "Subhani," which means "glory be to me." This has a similarly shocking implication, being a play on the common Muslim saying "Subhanallah," glory be to God. That Hallaj said on al-Haqq seems relatively certain, given that he became so strongly associated with the exclamation and also so early in history, but it's often mistakenly believed that this was the reason for his execution. In fact, this seems to have played no part in it at all. For sure, some people were shocked over a statement like that, but the general opinion has been that exclamations made during spiritual rapture are not liable to punishment according to Islamic law. They are said while in a moment of ecstatic, mystical experience, so one is not liable to be punished in the same way as someone who is sober, so to say. But we do get actual poems and quotes where he says an al-Haqq, but in other contexts. For example, there's a reference of this very phrase in one of his poems, which goes, "My unique one chose me for a unique truth, one to which no path leads. For I am the truth, a truth the truth deserved, clothing its essence with no more separation. Rising suns have manifested shining, glittering, and the rising suns are lightning." But what does this all actually mean? Was Hallaj saying that he was God? That God was incarnated in him in some way? In short, no, he isn't saying this at all. As we've explored, this seems to be a direct reference to the common idea and experience in Sufism of fana, or annihilation. When the mystic manages to reach a state where he no longer experiences himself or any individuality, all his attributes fall away. He becomes extinguished like the moth who flies into the flame. And now, nothing is experienced but the reality of God. No individuality remains, only the divine. So Hallaj isn't propping himself up to be divine. On the contrary, actually. This experience of union and the expression of I am the truth is the ultimate self-negation. There is no Hallaj left, only God. Sufis across history have always been very careful when expressing these ideas to avoid anything that might be understood as what is known in Arabic as hulul, which means incarnation, a doctrine associated primarily with Christians and perhaps Hindus to some degree. But this is not what Hallaj is expressing. And this becomes very clear from one of his poems. The Akhbar al-Hallaj says that one day Hallaj was in a mosque in Baghdad begging the people to have him killed. After which he says, "Is it you or I? That will be two gods in me. Far, far be it from you to assert duality. The he-ness that is yours is in my nothingness forever. My all added to your all would be a double disguise. But where is your essence from my vantage point when I see you, since my essence has become plain in the place where I am not? And where is your face? It is the object of my gaze, whether in my inmost heart or in the glance of my eye. Between you and me, there is an I am that battles me. So take away by your grace this I am from in between." In reality, there are never two things that become united, but can only be one reality that is experienced when the ego or the nafs, the self, has become annihilated. In this same story, Hallaj summarizes this nicely when he says that the path is between two, but there is no other with God. In his prose work, the Tawasin, he also talks about this union by employing the image of the moth and the flame. Quote, "The glimmer from the candle is the knowledge of reality. The heat from the candle is the reality of reality. Rejoining the burning candle is the real of reality. The moth can only reach his desires and true knowledge by rejoining the candle, by burning himself up in it." This is a theme that would be picked up and used by famous later Sufi poets like Rumi and Attrs. And later on in the same text, he also profoundly proclaims, "Now reality is reality, and nature is created. Hence, cast created nature far from yourself, so that you may become him, and he you in reality." Here, in a very short sentence, he nicely summarizes the idea of union and annihilation. But at the same time, while he seems to be talking about the same kind of experiences and and ideas that many other Sufis do, Hallaj is quite unique, sometimes at least, in the way that he expresses it, in the very shocking and provocative language that he uses. I'm sure if you have watched this channel for a while, many of these themes and poems will be quite familiar to you, right? If you've read Sufi poetry, this is kind of what that is, right? They talk about union and becoming annihilated and all this all the time, right? So this might seem like treading familiar water. We've heard this all before. This is actually not always the case with Hallaj. On the one hand, we have to remember that Hallaj is quite early. Again, he's one of the earliest famous Islamic mystics and Sufis. He lives in the 9th and early 10th century. So in that sense, he's significant for this reason, because he is one of the pioneers of this kind of Sufi poetry, this kind of language, which makes it interesting to study and consider. On the other hand, some of the poems of Hallaj, even keeping in mind all these things we know about how Sufis express themselves, even then he comes off as very shocking sometimes. And I think this is for the same reason. When we read later Sufi writers, Rumi, Attrs, Ibn Arabi, Ibn al-Farid, at that point in the Middle Ages, a kind of rule system and language has been established, right? Centuries have gone by, the Sufis have agreed on how we are supposed to talk about these ineffable experiences, how we express union without falling into something that sounds too much like hulul, like incarnation, for example. And even though they can be shocking, especially someone like Ibn Arabi or Shushtari, for example, they're always a bit careful, right? They're always a bit careful not to go too far. And even when they do go very far, sometimes they will add. It'll be like, I become united to God, but this is not hulul. It's very common for them to actually add that afterwards. This is very important. For Hallaj, some of these poems, even for someone who's used to Sufi poetry, they come off as really shocking. Take, for example, what is maybe his most famous poem. أنا من أحوى ومن أحوى أنا نحن روحاني حلنا بدنا فإذا أبصرتني أبصرته وإذا أبصرته أبصرتنا. I am the one I desire, the one I desire is I. We are two spirits dwelling in a single body. So when you have seen me, you have seen him, and when you have seen him, you have seen us. Two spirits dwelling in a single body. This is very unusual language and certainly runs the risk of being interpreted as something closer to incarnation than the classic Sufi metaphysics that we have described. In other poems, he talks about it as two spirits mixing. Quote, your spirit has mixed with my spirit, as ambergris is mixed with aromatic musk. If anything touches you, it touches me, and since you are me, we do not differ. Or, quote, your spirit was mixed with my spirit, just like wine and clear water. If something touches you, it touches me, for you are I in every state. Quite a strong statement, right? Even for a Sufi poet. So you can see why he is so famous and controversial, not only for his behavior, as we saw, which was quite unusual, but also for the very profound ways that he expressed himself, shocking ways sometimes that he expressed himself in his actual poetry. So union is at the center of a lot of his poetry. And some even seem to detect a kind of monistic metaphysics hiding behind the words too. In some ways, this is the natural extension of the idea that once we annihilate our ego, we experience God as the only reality. But at the same time, this is long before figures like Ibn Arabi would properly develop a system for that kind of philosophy. It's uncertain where Hallaj stands in terms of such ideas, but his poetry and writings might have served as an important background for how those later doctrines were formulated. Just listen to this poem, for example. His existence is through me, and my existence is through him. As for his description, he is the one who tells it. If not for him, I'd know no guidance, and if not for me, he'd have no knower. In every meaning there is something that means him, so tell those who contradict me you are wrong. There is nothing but the merciful, my friends, with which our spirits can be intimate. One indication of a broader metaphysical or theological picture becomes clear through Hallaj's focus on the theme of love. Now again, if you've watched this channel for a while, you'll know that what we're discussing here sounds annoyingly familiar. Themes of love and union are some of the most recurring themes in Sufism, and we've explored them numerous times before. But again, remember how early this is. Hallaj very much sets the foundation, in many ways, for Sufi expression and Sufi poetry. In terms of love, he seems to take inspiration here from the early female Sufi Rabia al-Basri, who spoke about love as the central axis in her mystical relationship with God. Hallaj seems to take this even further by placing it at the core of his metaphysics. All of existence is built on love. Love is its very foundation and reality. In what is perhaps one of his most beautiful poems, he says, "Love is in primordial eternity eternally. In him, by him, from him, it begins in him. Love is not temporal, since it was an attribute of the one whose martyrs are alive. His attributes are from him, in him, but not temporal, for temporality is what begins in things. When the beginning began, his love began as an attribute in that which began, and in him gleamed the shining. For the Lamb was affectionate with the inclined Aleph, and both were one, which means in the beginning. But in separation they are two, when they are together separately, one's the devotee and one's the Lord. These are the realities, the fire of longing, burning for reality, whether they stay or go. They're humble, worthless, when they are mad with love, for the mighty become humbled in their longing." But aside from these ideas of love and union, Hallaj also explores very fascinating topics in terms of religious lore and theology. This comes out perhaps most clearly in the aforementioned Kitab al-Tawasin. The Tawasin is a truly baffling mystical work. It is, as mentioned earlier, divided into 11 different chapters or short treatises dealing with different topics. The first chapter is basically dedicated to praising the Prophet Muhammad. Chapters 2 and 3 seem to explore themes of union and mystical annihilation. 4 and 5 are dedicated to the nightly ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, the so-called Mi'raj, but it is chapter 6 that is perhaps the most interesting and shocking. Because here, Hallaj introduces the idea that Satan, known as Iblis in Islam, is actually the true monotheist and worshipper of God. You see, in the Quran, it is told that when God created Adam, the first human being, he asked all the angels to prostrate themselves before this new creation, showing that the human being, at least in potential, is higher than the angels themselves. Iblis, or Satan, refused, however. He didn't want to bow down before Adam, and so was debased. Al-Hallaj has a very interesting take on this story, however. Rather than the usual interpretation of seeing Satan as rejecting God's command due to his own arrogance, here he's instead portrayed as the ultimate monotheist, refusing to prostrate before Adam because he would never prostrate before anyone but God, God's self. Quote, "God had said to him, 'Bow down before Adam, not before another than you, even if my curse falls upon you, and it would not hurt me.' And Satan said, 'I reject your command in order to affirm you holy. My mind is going mad because of you. What is Adam? Nothing but for you. Who am I then, I, Satan, to distinguish him from you?'" I don't think I need to tell you that this is a very radical interpretation, but it is one that kind of makes sense from one point of view. Satan becomes almost like a tragic hero in a certain sense. He's entirely devoted to God to the very end, but with a strength that simultaneously becomes his very weakness. Quote, "There had been no monotheist, Muwahid, comparable to Satan among the inhabitants of heaven. The essence appeared to him in all its purity. He forbade himself out of shyness even to wink at it and began to venerate the beloved in ascetic solitude. This strong devotion to God is also what leads to his downfall, because it does, even in this version of events, lead to a kind of arrogance. Satan sees himself as better than Adam because he is so devoted to God. Quote, "He fell into the ocean of majesty, he lost his sight in it, and said then, I who want no other way to you than passing through you, am I to be a second lover? You became proud. Had there been only a glance between us, it would have been fitting for me already to be proud and haughty. But I am he who has known you from pre-eternity. I am worth more than he," in other words Adam, "for I have served you for the longest time. No one of the two kinds of creatures knows you better than I. My intention touches you, your intention touches me, both existed before Adam. Whether I bow down before another than you, or bow down at all, I must return to my origin. Now you created me of fire, and fire returns to fire, according to a balance and a choice that is your own." So clearly, Hallaj isn't actually arguing for the goodness of Satan. He isn't saying that Satan is a good character. He isn't like turning the story upside down completely. He still has an arrogance, and he's punished for his arrogance and for not obeying God's command. But he adds this really interesting flavor to the story, this really interesting perspective where where Satan's arrogance comes from him being completely devoted to God. Right? His devotion to God is what leads to his arrogance in some way. It leads him to actually disobey God's command because he doesn't want to prostrate before anyone but God. And he knows that this will also lead to his punishment, to his being debased, but he still does it. He's that devoted to God. So it's a really sort of tragic character, and it's really, really fascinating. Hallaj says, "The most eloquent of mystics kept silent about Satan, and the sages lacked the strength to utter what they had learned about him. Satan is more informed than they about worship. He is closer than they to the being. He has devoted himself more zealously to serve him. He has kept more to his vow than they. He has drawn nearer than they to the beloved. The other angels bowed down before Adam because they were no longer standing, and Satan refused to bow down because he had been in contemplation a long time. And yet, alas, he was muddled. He ceased to trust in God. He said, I am worth more than he. He remained on this side of the veil. He wallowed in mud and embraced damnation for the post-eternity of post-eternities." Shocking as this idea may appear, it would be picked up by later Sufis as well. Perhaps most famously in the writings of Ayn al-Quzat, who, interestingly, together with Hallaj and Suhrawardi, remain the three martyrs of Islamic mysticism because they were all executed, something that was, in general, pretty unusual in these circumstances. In any case, these were the kinds of things that Hallaj was writing, and thus also what he was preaching and expressing through his different public outbursts and preachings. He had become very famous in Baghdad and around the different parts of the Islamic world, had aroused the attention of the authorities, both those sympathetic to his teachings, but also those who saw in him a great danger. And he had essentially inspired a wider movement of reform in society. He was a powerful man in some sense, and could potentially become even more powerful if things were allowed to continue. And I think this is at least one of the main reasons why things turned out the way they did. As we said, he associated with certain parts of the aristocracy, and when there was a failed coup in 908, things changed dramatically. The young caliph al-Muqtadir and his loyals had crushed the uprising, but in the wake of this event, new people were appointed in government. The vizier was changed, and this new one, a man called Ibn al-Furat, did not like al-Hallaj at all. In fact, Hallaj at this point basically became connected with the losing side of this palace intrigue. Wisely, as a result, he fled to Sus, but was eventually apprehended and was brought back to Baghdad, where he would be imprisoned and remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. But what was the charge exactly? Well, as we can clearly see, the political reasons behind it are pretty clear, but on paper he was accused of teaching hulul, or incarnationism, the very doctrine that we saw him rejecting in an earlier poem. Eventually, other charges were brought against him that he was a Shi'i sympathizer. If you remember, he had earlier had some very loose connections to the Zanj rebellion through his brother-in-law. And throughout his last years, he was also repeatedly accused of being an agent or sympathizer for the Qarmatians, an Ismaili Shi'i group at the time that was a thorn in the Abbasid side, and among other things would actually later go on to sack the holy city of Mecca and remove the black stone from the Kaaba. Now, there's no indication or evidence, as far as we know, that Hallaj had anything to do with the Qarmatis. As we saw, he seems to have been pretty strongly aligned with what would later become known as Sunni Islam. But nonetheless, these accusations remained, and he was even at one point exposed on a pillory in Baghdad with the town crier saying, "Behold the missionary of the Qarmatis." For over a decade, al-Hallaj remained imprisoned in the caliph's palace, where he wrote some of his most important works. Eventually, in the years 921 or 922, things finally came to a head. He was put on trial, and after some complications and discussions, he was sentenced to death. What was the charge? It wasn't his statements like an al-Haqq or any of the daring writings about union that so many people have assumed. Instead, it was a particular thing that he had said that was used as the evidence needed, where he said that one should, quote, circumambulate the Kaaba of the heart 7 times. This idea that the heart is the inner Kaaba is not an unusual statement in Sufism, but in this instance, perhaps also taking into account the story of the makeshift Kaaba he built in his backyard, this was taken to mean that al-Hallaj was rejecting the importance of the Kaaba in Mecca and the Hajj pilgrimage. Importantly, this proved to them that he was an agent for the Qarmatians and their plot to destroy the sanctuary in Arabia. The decision of Hallaj's execution was protested by a lot of people. He was popular and had many followers after all. As we mentioned earlier, his friend and fellow Sufi Ibn Attah organized a Hanbali demonstration against this decision, and when he strongly defended the honor of Hallaj, he too was actually beaten to death. And so, on March 26, 922, one of the great mystics of history saw his end. There are a lot of legends about how his execution took place, all of them very gruesome and dramatic. The most historically plausible is still very brutal. He was flogged with 500 lashes, his hands and feet were cut off, and he was suspended on a gibbet. And because the official word of approval from the caliph hadn't actually come yet, he had to spend all night on the gibbet before, the next morning, finally being beheaded. His body was then incinerated and the ashes were thrown in the Tigris River. According to the reports in the Akhbar al-Hallaj, the very night before his execution, the great mystic gives us one of his last statements in a poem. Quote, "I cry to you the death of souls whose witness went astray, in what is beyond how one meets eternity's witness. I cry to you the death of hearts, as long as clouds of revelation pour down seas of wisdom upon them. I cry to you the death of truth's language, for long ago it died, and its mingled memory is like nothing. I cry to you the death of rhetoric and the surrender of every orator's words in speech of understanding. I cry to you the death of all thinkers' illusions, nothing remains of them but the erasing of their bones. I cry the death, by your love, of the ethics of a people whose steeds were just the sorrow of repression. All of them are gone, neither essence nor trace remains, like the passing of Ad and the destruction of Iram. They follow the crowd, imitating their fashion, dumber than cattle and dumber than a beast of burden." Al-Hallaj, along with Ain al-Qudat and Suhrawardi, remain the 3 major martyrs of Islamic mysticism, and also he remains one of the most enigmatic mystics and figures in history. As we saw, while his execution was justified on religious grounds, it was, in its actual foundations, much more political, right? There were very clear political reasons, it seems, why they decided to have him killed. Although it should be pointed out that we can't really separate religion and politics in the same way that we do today. At this time, they're very much intertwined, but it's clear, at least to me, that the very chaotic political and social circumstances in Baghdad at that time is the primary reason why this execution happened, although it was justified officially based on religious dogmatic grounds. But even though he died, his legacy very much lived on. The Hallajiyya never became anything like an official Sufi order or a coherent group that we can find across history, but his intoxicated form of Sufism would reverberate for millennia. In many ways, he, along with Bastami, represent the earliest foundational figures of this type of mystical expression in this tradition. The daring poetry of Hallaj inspired the later masters like Rumi, Attrs, Ibn Arabi, Ashrustari, and Ibn al-Farid. But he always also continued to remain controversial. Even in later periods, when his legacy was very much established, these Sufis who would quote him or be influenced by him were also often inclined to discuss and defend Hallaj by placing his radical statements and exclamations within what they saw as an orthodox Islamic framework. In his biography of Sufi saints, Fariduddin Attad dedicates perhaps the longest section to Hallaj and praises him profusely. He says, "Slain by God on the path of God, the lion in the thicket of confirmation, the valiant and veracious warrior drowned in the surging sea, Husayn Ibn Mansur al-Hallaj, God's mercy be upon him. His undertaking was an astonishing affair. Wondrous revelations were his specialty, for he burned with both passionate yearning and the harsh flames of separation. Husayn was intoxicated, the restless and frenzied man of the age. He was a pure and honest lover. He struggled and strove mightily with marvelous austerities and wonders. He had high aspiration and great capability. He wrote many compositions containing difficult expressions about spiritual realities, secrets, ideas, and insights. He had a way of speaking, an eloquence, and a fluency that no one else had." But Attars then also has to mention that he was condemned by many Sufis and the controversies around him, in the process giving us a very profound explanation for the meaning of the statement al-Haqq. He says, "It seems strange to me that someone would consider it proper for the voice of 'Verily I am God' to come from a bush without the bush intervening. Why then isn't it proper for 'I am the real' to come from Husayn without Husayn intervening? Just as the real Most High spoke with Omar's tongue, for indeed the real speaks with Omar's tongue, so did he speak with Husayn's tongue. Incarnation and pantheism have nothing to do with it." Furthermore, the great Sufi metaphysician and master Ibn Arabi was somewhat ambivalent about his opinion on Hallaj. He clearly considers him a great accomplished saint and even as one of the great mystical poles in all of history when he says, quote, "I know of no believer in the one God who could have stitched and unstitched in speaking of his Lord, distinguished in the twilight the might and what it contains, and the moon when it is hidden, and arranged all of these complementary particulars among them as well as he. He was a light in the oncoming night." But at the same time, just like many of the Sufis in Hallaj's own day, he seems to argue that his condemnation is also somewhat legitimate, because, again, Hallaj revealed things openly that were supposed to be kept secret. Ibn Arabi says, "Just as it is a duty for a prophet publicly to reveal his signs and his miracles for the glory of his apostolate, it is the duty of a saint, a wali, coming after the prophet, to conceal his." So here we see a good example of how Hallaj's reputation can be a bit two-sided and ambivalent. Ibn Arabi sees him as a great spiritual pole, a great saint, a great wali in history, spiritual master. At the same time, he agrees with the Sufis that condemn him for saying these things publicly that should be kept secret. So he's ambivalent, right? And we find this a lot. Even those who praise him, like Attars, also always feel like they have to defend him in the next paragraph, because there's always this kind of discussion surrounding Hallaj. He remains controversial, even in the circles where he's praised. You know, they still have to acknowledge the controversies. At the same time, for his critics, the name of Hallaj became a weapon to be employed by applying it to later Sufis and mystics that were deemed to be heretical. The mystical Hermetic group of Sufis centered in the Recote Valley in Andalusia, which we have discussed in previous videos and which was most famously represented by Ibn Sab'in and his student Ash-Shushtari, were accused of precisely such a heresy. And in these later critical writings, they were explicitly connected with the so-called Hallajiyya, as connecting back to the teachings of this radical early mystic. And this is still the case today. Islamic scholars, both Sufis and non-Sufis, are divided on the status of al-Hallaj. Some seeing him as a heretic through and through, others see him as a wali, a saint that either acted irresponsibly or did nothing wrong at all. And also those who, in Alexander Knysh's words, simply suspend judgment on him. Knysh summarizes it nicely. He says, quote, "What does set al-Hallaj apart from his predecessors and contemporaries, including al-Bistami, was his uncompromising refusal to keep his daring experiences to himself. His involvement in the precarious politics of the court, combined with his bold temper and nonconformism, eventually led to his tragic death, endowing him with the halo of martyrdom that ensured his posthumous survival as an emblem of the mystical lover." So as you can see, Hallaj is a name that looms large in the history of Sufism and Islam. Both for his admirers and his critics, he is a central figure that one simply cannot ignore. His writings, ideas, and behavior were just so profound that they reverberated down the centuries, sending ripples even to our own day. It's probably true to some degree, then, that his execution marks a very significant point in the history of the Islamic world. And much of what has happened afterwards, especially when it comes to Sufism, has been in conversation with that event in one way or another. Today, his name is also famous worldwide. His poems and writings inspire people of all backgrounds and affiliations, and his very dramatic story is a shocking tale of mystics and palace intrigue and much else that is very engaging for a contemporary modern reader as well. Hallaj, at least to me, is without a doubt one of the most enigmatic and fascinating mystics in all of history. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I would like to extend, as always, a special thank you to my patrons who support this channel. I would highly encourage anyone who wants to support this channel to also, if you're able, to support me through my Patreon. I will leave links to that in the description. You can also leave a one-time donation through PayPal if that is more your thing, or simply like, comments, and subscribe to the channel. It all really helps so much, and I really appreciate it. Again, I want to remind you all that I also do music, and I recently released a single called Graal Stenk, which all of you, or those of you who have listened to it, seem to really enjoy, so thank you for that. You can find it on Spotify, on all the streaming platforms and music stores, or you can watch the music video on my other channel, Filip Holm, where I not only post my own music, but also videos about music, similar to the way I talk about religion here. So go subscribe to that channel if you're interested in that. You can also follow me on my socials to keep up and to keep updated on everything that I do. And that's it. So again, thank you for watching this video. Look forward to more stuff on Sufism, as always, in the future. And I'll see you next time.